Welcome to the session, Our Exams Are Cheat. My name is Mark Taylor. I'm an assistant head at a South London comprehensive, and I'm going to be chairing today's session. I'm also the London convener of the Institute of Ideas Education Forum. And if you like what you hear today, we meet on a monthly basis to discuss education on a Monday night. So let us know at the end if you're interested. Okay, so the session we're talking about is Our Exams Are Cheat. I'm going to go to the speakers fairly quickly, but you should bear in mind that this issue is very live, and the speakers have been told to take their own view on the topic, because at the moment we've got yesterday's paper, The Times, saying now Gove rewrites the rules on A-levels, and basically every day there's something going on about this topic. Claire Fox, the director of the Institute of Ideas, has written an article in this week's TES, I think, if I've had time to read it and take it in, defending the principle of exams, but I don't know how much else she said, so Philip was discussing that with me a minute ago. But as I said, the speakers have been told to take their own view, but obviously it also depends on you as the audience taking it the way you would like it to go. If you think they're missing something, or you want to hear a perspective that's not been addressed, feel free to raise those points. If you were here yesterday, you know that the speaking system is I've got to be very disciplined. So after about 6 minutes, I'm going to put a yellow card up and say 1 minute to go. And if any of the speakers goes on too long, they get sent home with a red card. Obviously, we look at this quite, hopefully in a flexible way, and I won't be over-disciplining all there may not be any speakers on the panel. But bear that in mind, so we're trying to keep to time. Okay, so the speakers today have got a really balanced panel with a range of different experience on this topic. I'm just in the order that they're speaking, I'm going to introduce them. First of all, we've got Philip Walters on my far left. He's chair of Rising Stars Educational Publisher. He used to be in charge of Polar Education, so he's got a massive range of experience in educational publishing. And he could be one of those people that you blame for producing the books that just make kids learn to the test. On the other hand, I'm sure Philip... Look at the red card, so there you go. Okay, so Philip will probably be having his own view on that one. Secondly, we've got Dr. Richard House on my left. He's from the University of Winchester, where he's senior lecturer in education. He's editor, I think, of a number of books which are available downstairs. Too Much Too Soon, Early Learning and the Erosion of Childhood, and author also of In, Against and Beyond Therapy. I think Richard's going to have a slightly different view on examinations, perhaps from the one that I've just mentioned, Claire Fox has raised, but I don't know. He says he's primed and ready to go. Thirdly, on my far right is Tina Isaacs. She's the senior lecturer at the Institute of Education, formerly the head of 14 to 19 regulation at Ofqual. So she's got an incredible insight into the question of assessment and the way it's delivered at the moment, and she's told me that she's got an interesting view to offer today. And then finally, on my near right, Dr. James Panton, in a way brings a lot of the things we're going to be talking about together, because he's balancing his experience from being a tutor at the University of Oxford. I think it's in 3 colleges there you've been a tutor, isn't it? And 4 still are. And he's also a tutor at a secondary school, Stowe in Buckingham. As well as that, he's associate lecturer in the social science at the Open University, and he's co-founder of the Manifesto Club. So with that range of experience, plus you in the audience, we hope that we're going to try and explore this question of whether exams are still worth the paper they're written on. You may be asked at some point whether you have cheated in an exam, something like that. We'd be very interested to know what the audience thinks. But again, we'll see how it goes and how it's opened up for us. Okay, so without any further ado, the first speaker, Philip.
Morning, everyone. My full title for this would be Our Exams Are Cheat, or The Perfect Storm of Perhaps Unintended Consequences. To better explain this, I thought it might be helpful to start with a quick historical but perhaps contentious review of how we got to a place where we're debating a question that implies an astounding lack of confidence in our key national exams. A lack of confidence that was perhaps, from my personal point of view, first expressed to me 15 years ago when I met Dave Perks who's sitting there, well anyway, let's go to who Dave Perks is here, probably most of you know. But I met Dave for the first time at the annual King's College lecture, which that year was on the subject of what is education for, and given by a guy called Nick Tate, who was then head of QCA, the Qualifications organisation as it was then. And after a pretty dull speech, we were all standing around sipping tepid Chardonnay, and I went up to Dave and I said, didn't know him, I said, what brings you here? He said, I've come to see the whites of the bastard's eyes. And I found this very arresting, and since then, well, if I wasn't a married man, I'd have gone off with him, really. I think...
for those people who are really interested in Dave Perks, he's speaking in the session after this one on preschool, but let's try and bring it back to love affair with knowledge. Yeah.
As well as talking about how we got to this place, I'll say a little bit about what I think the future may hold, and how that squares with what I think personally would be a good idea. Those of you who are under 40 in this room and who went to school in England or Wales are children of what was effectively a very new way of examining and testing school children that was introduced in the last government of Margaret Thatcher in the second half of the 1980s. You are the GCSE takers, and perhaps even more importantly, the recipients of the first formal national curriculum with a level of external testing at 7 and 11 and 14 that had never been seen before in this country and has hardly ever been replicated anywhere else in the world. However, what is often completely forgotten now is that when that testing regime was introduced then, the original idea was that it was meant to provide empirical collective data about the cohort in a particular year, so that the endless debate about educational standards falling or rising, which believe me went on then just as much as it does now, could have proper comparative data underpinning any judgments made about this. And what's more, and this is very important, the national tests were not originally meant to give data about the individual performance of the individual student or pupil. Of course, GCSEs were meant to produce results for the individual students, but there was a big change here too, in that both GCSEs and A-levels moved from being norm-referenced, that is, when you got a grade 1 or A at O-level, that probably reflected being in the top 10% of the cohort, and if you got CSE grade 4, that was meant to reflect the 50th percentile of the cohort, to being standard reference. That's to say that if students got above a particular mark, then they got an A grade. It was not in any way limited by a percentage of the cohort. To be fair, this wasn't actually at the time intended to be some crude, they shall all have prizes mood. There were obvious unfairnesses about norm referencing, but more unintended consequences awaited these standard referenced exams. To me, these laudable aims were soon overtaken by political and social events. Effectively, the consumerization of education that gathered place in the 90s, the moves towards the idea of choice, led to the creation of firstly the league tables of school achievements in these tests and exams, and then the faux marketisation of the exam boards themselves. This coincided with inclusion beating aspiration in terms of what was expected from students and schools. By the end of the millennium, there were only 3 exam boards, and only 3 years later, one of them became 100% owned by a FTSE 100 company. The other 2 had charitable status, which one could afford because it was supported by the University of Cambridge, but the other was much less well endowed and therefore sought more commercial sorts of solutions to its problems. In the first decade of the new millennium, the landscape looked like this. 3 exam boards competed for £300 million of examination fees, twice as much as was spent by schools in total on learning materials. Very often the USP for the exam board was the accessibility of the particular exam suite. In real money, that means how much easier those exams were. And therefore the school had a better chance of shining in the league tables. Any improvement was obviously going to be well received by the political masters of the time, who wanted to bathe in the reflected glory of apparently improving standards. The unintended, perhaps unintended corruption of the system had taken place. with the numbers of resits for each module of the exams growing through the roof, which led to more fees as well, and overall a decline in standards. That's not just my view. Although this was always vigorously denied by QCA and its successors, the rug was rather pulled from underneath that when Mick Waters, who'd been in charge of all of this at QCA a year after he retired, did in fact say that there had been a significant decline in standards. In a way, though, this is just sheer serious gossip about past failures. The deeper question is, what are these exams for? Are they about university entrance, world of work readiness, innate ability, knowledge accumulated, demonstration of creativity, something to do with social mobility or engineering, or all or some of the above? My personal view is that there are two priorities. The first is to assess innate aptitude and ability. The second is to review the student's full and rounded understanding of the subject that they've studied, whether it's traditionally academic or vocational. Everything else society needs from exams will follow from these two things being done really well. So how does this work in relation to all the recent changes that we've been hearing about? I'm a half supporter of what Michael Gove is doing because I think he has removed the foam, well, the environment where there's the foam archetyzation of the exam boards. But I'm less keen on carrying on with the 16+ exam. I would agree actually with what Stephen Twigg and at the other end of the political spectrum, Lord Baker, have been saying about this. I think we could get rid of that altogether, and we can do what they do in more or less every other country in the world, which is have some kind of school leaving certificate, baccalaureate, whatever you want to call it. I do think it would be useful to combine that with some testing about innate abilities and aptitudes, particularly at 14, and to some extent at 18, because that might provide us with a sensible reference point to get over the sterile debate we have about social mobility and whether an A achieved at Dulwich College is the equivalent of a B achieved at Brixton College.
Can you wind up?
I'll shut up. That's the end.
Thank you very much. Okay, now over to Richard.
Okay, good morning everyone. I'm a Battle of Ideas virgin. And just to prove that I'm a real Philistine, I'm a Barbican virgin as well. And I'm going to start with a couple of quotations. One is from Nicholas Rose, writing in his book, The Psychological Complex, where he said, childhood is the most intensely governed sector of personal existence. 1980s he wrote that. And secondly, and I'll wait till the end till I say who said this, education is about more than exams. Education is about opening minds, not just to knowledge, but to insight, beauty and inspiration. Now that was not Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that was Tony Blair, but highly significantly speaking in 1996, a year before he became Prime Minister. I'm going to focus on three broad themes. I'm going to focus on process rather than content. I'm going to look at psychoanalysis. I'm going to look at Marxism. I'm going to look at post-structuralism. And I've got my own very, very sort of strong views about exams and assessment. There's a whole literature. There's Warwick Mansell's book, The Education of Numbers, Tyranny of Testing, Tom Forthorpe's classic, The Limits of Educational Assessment, Beyond Testing, The Death and Life of the American School System, and a very recent book on performativity, which I do highly recommend. So there's a mountain of literature which challenges, in a very fundamental way, the whole idea of examination, testing, etc. And I could spend the rest of my talk trying to summarise those arguments. So what I'm going to do is to open up some questions that I think have to be thought about before we're even going to be in a position to reach any kind of sensible view about the examination system. First of all, in psychoanalysis, I want to talk briefly about anxiety and the unconscious, because first of all, there's the idea that that we are always disowning and projecting both individual and cultural fears onto children and onto childhood. And this is a process that I think goes on all the time with very few people being kind of aware of that and what the consequences might actually be of that. Secondly, there's a whole issue of us all unconsciously acting out from our own childhood and schooling histories. And then there's the whole question of what you might call the emotional experience of learning and teaching, and what the consequences of a kind of rigorous system of examinations might be at both the conscious and the unconscious level on both children and teachers. And I think that whole realm of thinking needs to be kind of factored in and thought about in any kind of sensible view about the examination system. Secondly, Marxism. I think we need to return a bit to what Bowles and Ginters were saying back in the 1970s, while of course being very careful to actually avoid a kind of crude reductionist viewpoint that the education system can be derived completely from the capitalist mode of production. I think people like Palancis showed that kind of reductionistic thinking is very simplistic and not very helpful. But nonetheless, I do think that those kind of ways of thinking about the education system are nonetheless very important. And there's a whole question regarding what might be the features of the examination system, its competitiveness, as the individualised nature of it, the kind of dividing up children into kind of hierarchies of competency, ready for the kind of labour market and sort of capitalist social relations, if I can use the Marxist terminology. And I just think that it's very important to return to those kind of questions that were asked by Bowles and Ginters, Louis Althusser in his famous paper, The Ideological State Apparatus, 1971. These are seminal writings which I think throw a great deal of light on the way in which the education system, to a certain extent, although it has some sort of relative autonomy, nonetheless is serving some function within a system, within the economic system, and we can't but take a position on that if we have views about the economic system, and I certainly do myself. Thirdly, we can look at all these issues from a kind of post-structuralist, postmodern, Foucauldian viewpoint, which looks at the audit culture, the surveillance culture, the sort of consequences of that culture on teachers, on children, indeed on policy makers. And there's a wider question which comes out of a sort of deconstructive way of thinking about this, which is where does this notion of assessment, where does it come from? How is it being kind of culturally created? What's its historical context? And those are the kind of questions that a sort of post-structuralist way of thinking begins to kind of challenge us to think about. So rather than just, for example, taking the examination system for granted as a kind of fixed sort of necessity, there's a kind of question about, well, I mean, what is the kind of meaning of these terms? What's the kind of what are the kind of discursive effects of the way in which we are positioned by these kind of discourses. And I think what I'm wanting to say is that until we kind of reflect on a kind of psychoanalytic way of thinking about the assessment system, a kind of maybe post-Marxist way of thinking about it, and a post-structuralist way of thinking about it, and to think about what that kind of process might actually mean. Until we engage in that, I don't think it's going to be at all useful for us to get involved in talking about the kind of particularities and the details and the kind of content of the system without being kind of informed by these wider issues. So I'm going to stop before the red card's been flashed out.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, now over to Tina.
Right, and I'm going to do exactly what Richard just warned us against, which is actually go straight in for the content. I have to say, Philip, I'm extremely annoyed with you because you have stolen my title, or what I was going to speak about. Having worked for first QCA and then Ofqual for 15 years, I can't seem to escape it, regardless of being at the Institute for Education and I do run a master's degree in educational assessment, so it pays my mortgage, therefore I feel I need to support it. But what I want to talk about today is actually quite specific, because I just want to get you to think about something that's very topical, has been in the newspapers of late, and that is what I'm calling the perfect storm of GCSE English this summer. So has everybody at least had an inkling of what was going on this summer with GCSE English? And I can see that there are probably some people in this room who perhaps even took it. So the meteorological definition of a perfect storm is a particularly violent storm arising from a rare combination of adverse factors. The term, interestingly enough, dates back from the 18th century. You can tell I'm a historian by training. And is also commonly used to describe a particularly bad or critical state of affairs arising from a number of negative and unpredictable factors. So what I'm basically going to argue in the next 5 minutes, which isn't very long to argue anything, is that what happened this summer with GCSE English was neither cock-up nor conspiracy, but absolutely inevitable. And while I'm explaining what happened this summer, which is what I'm going to try to do, I want you, in the back of your minds, to think about fairness. I'm not going to be speaking about fairness at all. But what I want you to think about is fairness in education. Fairness to whom, fairness when, and fairness why. So, the summer of 2012 English GCSE was absolutely tantamount to a perfect storm. It was a confluence of factors, most of which had unintended consequences, negative consequences. They all played together to cause the media storm, and I will argue that the media, as its wont, exacerbated what went on, of which Ofqual, which is where I used to work, and the awarding bodies, whom Philip has mentioned, found themselves in the center in August and September of this year. Now, the factors were pretty much assessment-driven, but they also have their roots in curriculum. So, going back to Richard's notion of wanting to understand what students should know, be able to do, what they should have as a curriculum. So, I'm just going to list 9, which is amazing, 9 elements that contributed to this perfect storm. I could have thought of more. I will try not to be technical because I realize that this is not a technical audience, but part of the problem with all of what happened this summer is that much of what went on was very technically complex and based on all sorts of statistical evidence. So, what are my 9 elements in fewer than 5 minutes? First of all, a content element. The new English GCSEs now have 3 syllabuses: English language, English literature, and English, where there had been only 2, English and English literature. Now, there were a whole host of unknowns associated with who was going to enter which students for what qualifications. It had been very obvious. So everyone took English. Most people took English and English literature. Well, who were you going to put onto which course now? And it ended up that, for the most part, the more talented part of the cohort, or the people who were better at exams, went in and did English language and English literature, while the least able part of the cohort, again, based on examination, key stage 2 results, by the way, went into English literature. So that's factor number 1. Now you have another curriculum factor, the inclusion of functional English in the English and English language syllabuses. And for both of those syllabuses, it's 45% of the content. Functional skills English is new. No one could possibly have anticipated what would happen with its inclusion in these new qualifications. There was also new content added. So aside from functional skills English, English language contains new material that people who are used to English language A-level would have recognized as kind of baby English language A-level material. But again, who knows what the consequences for that new material is going to be on teaching and learning. The introduction of modular assessment. This is new. There was actually one syllabus that had modular assessment before, but we'll ignore that. So now you've got GCSEs new for this summer's awarding that are in 4 parts rather than just 1 or 1 with coursework. The absence of 23,000 students from independent and selective schools who migrated onto other English qualifications, primarily the IGCSE, but other qualifications as well. Most of those 23,000 students would have achieved top grades had they been on the English language and English literature syllabuses. Okay, now I'm getting a tiny bit technical, so forgive me. Coursework, now known as controlled assessment, the weighting for the coursework increased. Again, for the first time, you are now talking 60% weighting for coursework for English language and English, where it had been much less than that. And this factor was exacerbated by the fact that both English, which is taken primarily by the least talented of the cohort, and English language use the same controlled assessments. Okay? So you've got the same coursework in these 2 different syllabuses with unexpected factors coming into play. Now, teachers, quite rightly, I would have as well, believed that the cut score, the grade point, for those 2 controlled assessments and those 2 different syllabuses would be the same. And they also thought, and I'll get to this in a second, that those cut scores would be the same in a June sitting as they were in the January sitting. So here's where we get to the January-June conundrum. The awarding bodies found themselves setting grading standards in this brand new qualification with all this stuff going on, all this noise on the wire, setting standards on just a few January entries. There weren't very many people, proportionately, who actually cashed in January. And I just want to point out, without going into a deep explanation, that setting standards for the first time is far more difficult than maintaining those standards over time. Teacher behavior was one of the factors, and again, quite understandable teacher behavior, but many teachers mistook cut scores for grade levels. So again, don't want to get into details, but setting the grade boundaries is something that awarding bodies do every single time, and they can and always often do set those cut scores at different levels for different grades from one sitting to the next. And then, and this one I'm just going to skirt over because it would take me, I'm getting my yellow card. This last one, if you're really interested, catch me at the break, or if you're really an anorak like me, but I'm just going to mention it because it did make a difference. there was a switch in the way awarding bodies awarded from comparable performance to comparable outcomes. And in essence, that switch got rid of grade inflation. And again, if you're interested in technical details, I can tell you later. It gets rid of grade inflation, but it has unintended consequences that are not predictable at the examination level. So I guess what I want to leave you with is my fear that this inevitable perfect storm can go wrong again when the new EBCs come on board, although some of the factors such as modular assessment won't exist. But I believe, and I could probably list you 6 fresh ones, that there will be new, other unanticipated factors that will arise. So thank you.
Okay, by now you should be thinking of some questions. So there's lots of things on the table, and before we go to them, Jack.
Well, I was going to try and give a post-analytic, post-Marxist, post-structuralist, postmodernist account, but I'm feeling utterly oppressed by Marx's kind of tyrannical structures of timekeeping, and I'm worried that I'm going to get a 3-month speaking ban. So I'm just going to give you a couple of anecdotes. But I'm going to try and give you a couple of anecdotes within a context. I think there's probably a lot of quite important debates to be had about GCSEs versus IGCSEs and AS and A-level and lots of other kind of acronymous disputes and debates. But I agree entirely, I think, with Richard on the point that there's no point in us really taking seriously those discussions until we first answer the question of what it is we actually want to do, what role we want exams to play within the educational context, what we want to be examining, what we think we're going to learn from the examination process, what should people be tested on. And I also, much to my horror, have discovered that I agree entirely with Tony Blair that education is about more than exams. It very clearly is. Nonetheless, I'm reactionary enough to think that exams are just about the best mechanism that we have of discriminating between the level of educational achievement that has been gained by students, and I think that discrimination is hugely important both for us socially, but also actually for each and every one of those individuals in terms of measuring their progress and setting possible standards for their progress. But I just want to put my anecdotes in the context of saying I think there's 2 things that we've lost sight of that for me would be fundamental to any education system that would be worthwhile, and thus that would have to be included in any account of what kind of exams we want. I think the first thing is that socially I would suggest that we've lost belief in really the authority of knowledge, of the transformative capacity that knowledge can have and that a knowledge-based education system can play in children and young people's lives. And the second thing that I think we've lost touch with or lost faith in is the capacity of young people themselves to engage with that knowledge-based educational process, and through that process to create themselves, to make themselves in the world, to transform themselves, and thus to have many of the kinds of opportunities for determining their own course in life that can only really come through that transformative educational experience. I think both of those are really missing from what we actually provide and conceive education to be. And when I say that we've lost sight of them, I don't for a minute mean that these were always at the core of everything that education was always about. I'm not intending to present some kind of jerry-made that requires that we go back to some 1950s structure of education. I think there were some elements to that were of great benefit, but I think it's undoubtedly the case that a great many kids lost out from many of the problems in that former system. So I don't for a minute think that we should return to a previous system. I do think, though, we should return to an understanding of the significance of knowledge and the importance of knowledge and subject orientation within education. So let me just give you my 2 anecdotes of where I think perhaps we've lost sight of these things. The first comes from my experience of being a school teacher for all of 14 months. And about 4 weeks into my teaching politics AS level, I set one of my classes the first big essay exercise. To what extent does the first past the post electoral system produce representative government in UK elections? I knew, because I've been told, that in order to understand what an essay is and what it requires, the students need to know how many marks it's worth, so I wrote 25 marks in big bold letters. I was going to say I wrote it on the blackboard, obviously I didn't, I typed it up on my smartphone, but you know the principle, okay? I was then surprised and quite annoyed that the students told me they couldn't possibly answer this question well. I was surprised and annoyed because we'd spent at least the preceding week going through in detail ideas of democratic representation and the role of first past the post and all its kind of technical tedium. But actually the kids were right and I was wrong, because it turned out that they knew the exam specification far better than I did. A 25-mark essay answer has the following marks available. It has 8 marks for knowledge and understanding, that's assessment objective 1. It has 9 marks for analysis and evaluation, or assessment objective 2. And you probably all know this anyway, but it has another 8 marks for communication, or assessment objective 3. And in order to get marks for assessment objective 2, that's analysis and evaluation, the biggie, the 9 marker, you need to demonstrate that you can compare and contrast both sides of an argument, that you can show knowledge of contrasting viewpoints and perspectives. And the difficulty is I hadn't taught them any positive aspects or points in answer to the question how representative is first past the post in the electoral system, because as everybody knows, first past the post is not a representative electoral system. There might be many benefits to it, if you like that kind of thing, but it's not a representative system. So they couldn't possibly get decent marks for analysis and evaluation of assessment objective 2. So I reworked my question to make it the case that they could talk about strengths and weaknesses of first past the post generally. The point is the kids were right and I was wrong, because they knew that what they were supposed to be doing was writing to an exam specification. I had foolishly thought what they were supposed to be doing was developing an intricate and detailed and in-depth understanding of questions to do with democracy and electoral systems and how we might understand democratic representation. And that's really my first example of where I think knowledge is fundamentally not there. Real knowledge, knowledge that one makes one's own through a process of engagement and struggle with it. That is not something that we're looking to test. On the contrary, actually, what we're doing is we're designing the content of the course once we've already decided what it is and how we're going to test at the end. So therefore, the content of the course, the actual stuff that they study and learn, is indeed determined entirely by how they're going to be tested at the end. So I've now become a much better teacher, which is to say that I make sure that what I'm teaching the kids is what they'll need to know for the test. Oh, you're kidding, Ref. I've got a whole other anecdote. I'll do this one quickly. I'll do this one very quickly. This is an entirely different context. My neighbour asked me to help his son with some GCSE maths, and having struggled to get a B in my higher maths 150 years ago, obviously I felt entirely qualified. So we sat down at my dining room table to work our way through some past paper questions, and I got stuck on question 5, part C. And I was stuck, not so much because I couldn't work out how to do it, but because knowing the importance of the marks associated with a question, as I now do, I was confused that part A was worth 2 marks, and we'd done it in 10 seconds. Part B was worth 2 marks, and we'd done it in about 1.5 minutes. Part C was taking me a good 15 minutes to work my way through it. So I think I understandably thought there must be a quicker way of doing this, there must be something this kid needs to know. I don't know what it is, I told him I don't know, go and ask your teacher, see the appropriate response. I then called a friend of mine who is a maths teacher and former examiner and asked him, how do you answer this question? He said, you answer it in exactly the way that you had gone about trying to answer it. And I said, but that was taking me 15 minutes, and it was only worth 2 marks. He says, well, here's what we do in the GCSE syllabus. We don't want to not have hard questions, because we want to stretch the bright kids. But if we give a high number of marks for answering hard questions, then any kid who can't answer the hard question is going to lose a high number of marks. So it's simple mathematics. If you can't answer a hard question and it's worth 10 marks, you can't possibly get an A or a B. So rather than discriminate against those kids who are weaker at mathematics by giving high marks to hard questions, we give low marks to high questions just the same as we give low marks to easy questions, and that way everyone has the chance of doing well in the exam. And that, I think, is really very fundamentally selling students short and teaching students, or I should say cheating students, out of their exam possibilities, because what we're actually doing there is paying far more attention to the idea of getting everyone through a system, including them in a system that will make them feel as if they've done well out of it,
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm very keen to go straight out. I don't know if anybody got questions. Right, before I do that, I'm just going to try something. There are 2 students in the room from my school. They're hiding at the moment, but I don't care. I want everybody to stare at them. They're just over there, behind that gentleman. They've got a history test on Thursday on the causes of the Cold War. And I basically want to know from the panel, should they, if I'm getting you right, do you think they're basically part of a capitalist, sort of making money is more important, according to the educational publishing agenda going on at the moment? And so maybe the books that they're reading might not be the right things for them. It won't have the right knowledge in. Is that one way of looking at what you're saying, and then hold that? Richard, I think you might be saying that they're part of a machine. They're cogs in a machine. They're just, you know, as a teacher, I'm actually watching them and controlling them rather than liberating their mind. I think, Tina, you're saying that the exam system is so complicated, because I got the feeling from you that it's just a bit of a fiddle, because we're drawing so many different lines on the actual, we're calling English language, English lit, functional skills, anything we can to say that we're succeeding. And James is saying that they shouldn't be afraid to fail, because it's better to fail and learn something from that. Now, I might be getting that wrong, and I don't know if there's anybody else in the room who's doing an exam. Could you put your hand up if you were on an exam course? I basically want to know what the panel would tell those people doing exams to do. So, if I got it wrong, go with it another way. But just sort of, what would you say to someone who's doing an exam? Is it worth the paper it's written on, from what your perspective? Starting with Phil.
I don't think I said what I didn't mean to say what you think I said. If I said it, I apologise, but I don't really mention publishing. You know, I mean, I won't get into all of that because it'll bore everybody to death. The whole there has been, I think, the kinds of arrangements that there have been exclusive arrangements between exam boards and certain educational publishers. I'm not, in my view, as a citizen, what I think is right. I don't think that should have happened. I think it's very odd that a FTSE 100 company owns one of the exam boards. And when you say that to people who are not aware of it, they go, blimey, that's a really, really odd thing. Now, it's a bit of a different thing to say that that means I think every textbook that you might be studying in history is a load of rubbish and isn't worth the paper it's written on. That's a bit of a different question than the exam itself, whether, you know, I think modern world history, you've got, which is the GCSE that's been done for time immemorial now, and we see another swastika, we're all kind of shoot ourselves really. I think that it's a very, very odd exam. I think it does test some things and does look at some things in a really rather interesting way. But I find it very odd that you can, for example, have a module about the US involvement in the Second World War and not mention Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It seems very strange to me, just in terms of a kind of narrative that you might want to be part of. So I would say that there are some very good and there's some less good textbooks out there, which provide wider context, but the better ones provide the wider context, etc., etc. But I do think there are issues to do with the rather odd nature of the specifications, as we now call them.
Okay, thank you. Richard.
Okay, I'll try and be very brief. I've got a 15-year-old daughter who's right in the throes of all this at the moment, GCSEs. I'm a great fan of Albert Einstein, and his writings. He's written very, I think, insightfully about the education and schooling process. And he said that education begins when you forget everything you learnt at school. And what I try to do with my daughter is to reassure her that what you the achievements that you have from the examination system are just an extremely narrow part of her value as a child, as a person, as a kind of human being. And that there are lots and lots of people, her father being one of them, who are doing their best to kind of change what we see as being a very harmful system in kind of lots of different ways. But given the fact that the reality is that the system kind of does exist, and it does have some sort of currency in terms of the kind of careers that people have, although it doesn't totally determine that, because again, returning to that great scientist Albert Einstein, who failed his exams at 14 and who got very kind of critical school reports for spending most of his schooling hours staring out of the window, wondering. And of course, we all know where he finished up with that wondering. That there's something much more important in life than the results of exams and tests. And I just think just to give that kind of reassurance to our children in the face of the sort of countervailing messages that they're getting from all over the place is just really, really important.
Okay, thank you. Tina?
Well, I feel that I have to agree with a couple of my fellow panelists who have actually said that there are things in examinations and tests and any kind of assessment that's probably worth knowing about. You know, as a student, where you've got to, what more you need to do in order to achieve something. It tells you something about progression. I hate to say this, but life is about discrimination, not discrimination that is discriminating amongst people, and exams are kind of part of that. I think that what's gone wrong is that we've made this examination system much more about the exams driving the curriculum rather than the curriculum driving the assessment. And so if there are bits of knowledge, and I agree that there are bits of knowledge that we hope to share with all of our students, the challenge is to make tests worth teaching to rather than the other way around, which is not terribly easy. So I also would get rid of GCSEs, were I in charge, and substitute them with something like a school leaving certificate at age 18, especially since the participation age is being raised to 18. GCSEs are really not serving the function that they used to. But I also believe that the kind of feedback and judgment that you can get from assessment is invaluable.
Okay, thank you. James?
Well, I agree with pretty much all of what's just been said. I think exams and tests are important. I think it's entirely problematic if what we teach is determined by what we're going to test in exams and tests. I think that's entirely cart before horse, or even maybe arse over tit. However, I think that my advice would be, because exams are important, you girls need to ace your test. My advice to both you and perhaps to your teacher is, you know, maybe let's think about a kind of imaginative system where you could be set a question to answer, and your teacher might be bold enough to think that he could answer it and himself make some discriminating judgment without a marking guide in order to tell him which bits of your answer he should tick. I suppose what I'm saying is in expecting more of students in terms of what they could do, more qualitative engagement, more discriminatory engagement, with ideas and with an understanding of, in this case, the causes of the Third World War. Causes of the Cold War. What we would actually be doing, I think, is also, you know, perhaps being brave enough to actually trust teachers to know a bit about their subject area, maybe even to be interested in their subject area, and to think that it was worth imparting, and therefore to be willing to make some qualitative judgments, to be willing to use their own judgment in terms of what is good and what is bad. So I mean, that would be my, you know, advice to you. Whether that's going to, you know, fit in well with also getting your students a decent mark in the exam.
I'm under a lot of pressure to get these grades, James. It's my job on the line, you know.
Well,
okay. Right, let's go to the audience. Where are there microphones in the audience? Right, okay. We'll start at this side, so we'll try and, if you give one to that lady there. Yeah, we'll take a few questions at a time, and then we'll come back to the panel, and then we'll go out again.
I work in a good university and I teach first year undergraduates as well as students at other levels as well. And I just want to highlight 4 things that are partly pressures that the panel have referred to, but 2 of them are quite unique and special to universities. The first one is that when I look at, when we get to the point of doing a module assignment, the levels of anxiety and stress amongst my first year undergraduates are now so high that we spend an inordinate amount of lecture time, seminar time, feedback online and other areas dealing with that stress and anxiety. It is tedious, it is a bottomless pit. It means that one is sidetracked from being rigorous, robust and inspiring and take on the role of some form of therapist. And I find that highly problematic. The second thing is that I think we're increasingly dealing in universities with the things that you've described, these sort of the production line of very high levels of instrumentalism and experiences of spoon feeding to the point which again reinforces the anxiety and the stress because the students want spoon feeding through the assessment. Now obviously I'm not saying that one can't, as an inspiring and confident enthusiastic lecturer, wean them off all of that, but it's a huge task. But the other 2 things that are now coming in, which I see undermining both my own confidence, which is a bit of a shock to the system, but also my colleagues, is the fear of the results of the National Student Survey, which now ranks us not just on whether we're a teacher that inspires them and builds their self-esteem, but also basically whether we get them good marks. So that's the National Student Survey is being used in universities like mine as a performance management tool. And then the 4th thing is the growth, it's almost like a sort of flip side of everything that we're seeing in the school system, which is that my university publishes on its website higher numbers of first-class degrees than ever before, and I sit in an exam board and listen to the nudging up, quite artificially actually, of students' degree classification so that we look good in the league tables. So the 4 pressures, I think, make it even more difficult to do what I completely agree with James and I know Mark's own approach to teaching is, which is to go beyond all of that and try and make the students see the knowledge as something really important and wonderful for its own sake. But those 4 pressures have got to be dealt with first.
Okay, thank you. And then just coming forward on the same side, I think we've got a lady. Yeah.
I'm a sixth form student at Addey and Stanhope School, but spent my secondary and sort of junior education in a private school. And one thing that really shocked me is I had my first lesson when someone was actually sent out at 16, and going from a very kind of cushy, very sort of, everyone's a lot better behaved, a lot smaller classes. And my question is, how can you expect students to have, when you compare private and state schools, everyone seems to think they're doing so much better, but it's completely inevitable. If you've got smaller classes, how can you compare the 2 when they're just completely incomparable situations?
Okay, thank you. And then coming forward again, there's a girl here. Yeah. Sorry, young lady.
I'm also a sixth form student at Addey and State School, and like this brought up so many questions to me and so many, okay. And you said you were going to ask, have you ever cheated in an exam?
Yeah.
And I've never wanted to cheat an exam, but I've been taught by my teachers to cheat an exam. Like the specific thing being modern foreign languages, which I'm really passionate about personally, but in the orals, you're told to learn your oral off by heart and just say it. That's not teaching, that is actually cheating. But I haven't done anything wrong, I've been told to do that. And that, I think it's a prescription that exams put on you that ends up with teachers having to teach like that.
Thank you for that example, and of course there's lots of other people in the room who may have a similar story. Just on languages, of course, you also find schools entering students for what's called their home language, rather than a language that's being taught to them new, so they get a qualification, and that gets seen as something that makes the school successful because it goes to the 5 A stars to C. So you're right in both ways, but the whole thing is, let's say, problematic. Now we have the next person. This is actually Dave Perks, who Philip's in love with. But
I can't help myself.
I know, he is lovely, so let's see what he's got to say.
The thing that struck me is if you weren't careful listening to the debate from the panel, you might get the idea that there's a general cynicism about examinations. And I think that's incredibly dangerous, especially to any young people in the room who might be dealing with that. Because actually, they're a celebration of your achievement. And that's what we have to put forward. And if we don't do that, we are destroying the whole purpose of the education system that we operate in. And yes, it is true that an examination is a foreshortened exercise to try and find out where you are. And it has problems and all the rest of it. It's a very human exercise. And that's another thing you should remember, is that what you're doing is judging yourself against your peers. And that's the standard that we set. And that is a very real standard. It's not made up, it's real. So trying to get away from that and trying to find some mechanistic tricks to get around that system is a disaster for the entire education system. And I think you've just heard that everybody's at it, trying to find a way around it, trying to find the tricks to beat the system. And it's a joke. If you do that, you invalidate the whole thing. And the problem we have is that, and I very much agree with what James said, is that when you've given up on knowledge, then the whole examination system is a trick. And we have to go back and say, why do we want young people to be educated? And really reinforce that statement about what we believe education is for. It's not for everything. It's about learning something that you want to learn and judging yourself as how well you've learned that, how well you've understood that, how well you know that subject. And when you take it like that, actually failing the exam is not as bad as it's made out to be, because then you know that you are not at the same level as somebody else who has passed it. And I think that is the sort of standard that we need to bring back.
Okay. I'll be asking Dave in his session after this then, is he going to enter his students for national exams, or how is he going to deal with that issue? But we'll carry on with the next member of the audience here.
Thanks. Philip mentioned Mick Waters, the ex-head of the QCA. I saw Mick Waters speak this summer at the Festival of Education. His theme was school life should be more like real life, or particularly working life. And as part of this, he showed a photograph of an examination hall with rows of desks, children sitting separated, concentrating at their desk, working alone. And he said, this is ridiculous. Where else in real life would people be forced to work on their own this way? Because usually you'd be collaborating with others, you'd be looking on the internet, and so on and so on. And afterwards I thought about that and thought, no, that's actually wrong, because real life is full of occasions where you have to rely upon your individual knowledge and wit, and anybody who's ever given a presentation to colleagues or clients will know that, and I've got an example of it here. So my question is, why is the internalisation of knowledge by individuals so undervalued by people like, influential people like Mick Waters? And second question is, if you have another debate on this same subject, can you get him on the panel?
Yeah. Okay, two up the front here, then we'll take the panel and then we'll go back out again.
I'm a sixth form student all the way from Blackburn, and I've always found throughout my whole educational life that the best teachers are the ones who teach me the subject, not the exams. Because then when I go into the exams, even if there's a question that I don't quite understand properly, I'll be able to give a decent shot rather than just having to answer the ones that I've learned. I'm quite glad to say one of those teachers is with me here today. I did. And that the best teachers, especially at the sixth form, are the ones that will teach me the stuff that might not come up and is less likely to come up, but at least I'll know it afterwards.
Okay.
It's the thing I'm interested in is my personal prejudice, and I hope Tina doesn't get upset by this, is that I really think assessment is the nerd end of the education discussion. I mean, it really should just be a really routine technical matter. And yet the really interesting thing for me is that we've got a brand new curriculum for primary English, maths, science, significant changes in terms of knowledge and things that are being prioritised, and it gets virtually no response. And we've had a whole summer dominated by an exam board setting a boundary, which they do all the time, which is a really routine thing. So my question is, why is the interesting end of the education discussion, which is knowledge, curriculum, I mean these are fundamental issues, being displaced by a discussion of assessment, which obviously is important, but really not that, you know, a technical matter, and that's the thing I'm sort of interested in.
Okay, so we're going to go in reverse order with the panel. Please keep it brief, but we have about 30 minutes for the whole of this session finishing. On the table we've got things like spoon feeding, private schools, state schools. We've got 3 sixth form students who've been brave enough to say what their perspective is. Cynicism, the exam hall and how people can internalise their knowledge when it's being done, and again the issue of knowledge versus assessment. Okay, so we're going to start with James.
Well, I don't know if I can answer all that in 30 minutes, but I'll try. I just want to pick up on the cheating thing, because I mean I think that's hugely important. I think we've got a very peculiar system from the perspective of students, because insofar as the content of a syllabus is now increasingly about making sure that the kids know what they need to know for the exam. In other words, know the right gobbets of information to tick the right boxes on an examiner's script. Then actually what students are being asked to do is to learn the right answer, the right phrase, the right way of expressing a particular point, the right argument. There's a very fine line between that and plagiarism, because if I give you the right answer, you know, and if I've got any sense I'm going to get the right answer out of the exam guide or the textbook that we're using, you know, just to make sure that I understand it right, and you then learn the right answer and give it back to the examiner and the examiner ticks it, you know, we've all just processed this same right answer. And the extent to which any of that is actually your understanding, I think is entirely missing. And that's where what we have is, you know, not just teachers kind of using tricks in order to increase your chances of getting good grades, and I'm sure that's very prevalent, we're all under pressure, but actually it strikes me the whole system is based around institutionalised cheating, which is to say, at no point are you expected or allowed to actually work with this material yourself, actually formulate your understanding of it, and put that out there, you know, stick your head above the parapet and test out an idea or an argument and see if it's any good. And that, I think, is where the plagiarism thing is absolutely central to all that we're doing now in education, you know, and that's a pretty sad state of affairs. And I think the other thing, the point that Dave Birch makes, which is really important, is that actually, in all of my criticisms of the examination system at the moment, I don't think we should forget that the exams themselves are still difficult for students. You know, the exams themselves are still a stress for students, and Catherine talks about that in the university sector, and I'm very familiar with that as well. It's a hugely stressful process to go through. I happen to think we're testing on the wrong basis and testing the wrong things, you know, but it's no easier for kids. I think that's the wrong way of understanding it. It's simply far more instrumentalized, far more result-driven than it is actually about the kind of content of what you understand and what you know. Should I be quiet?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Very concise answer. Tina.
Right. We heard from 7 different people who had 7 different points of view, but I think there's one thread common to all 7, and that is the accountability agenda. It's not examinations that are bad. It's not testing or assessment that's bad, although I do agree with the last person that we should pay much more attention to the curriculum, what we want people to know and be able to do when they either leave primary or leave secondary. So could I just say that I couldn't agree with that more. But it's not the examination system. It's not the fact that we assess. It is the purposes to which we use those assessments. And in this country and in many other countries, so we're not unique there, the main purpose, unfortunately, of assessment now, both at the university level and at the secondary and primary level, is accountability. It's about school accountability, it's about teacher accountability, and student outcomes play a very distant second to that accountability agenda.
Okay, so before I bring in Richard, just on the principle that an educated person can make distinctions, you might notice that we're talking about assessment a lot. And again, that's a very clear shift in language, because we used to talk about examinations. And if, I don't know what Dylan William, if you're in education, you may have heard of his name, he's led the idea that, of assessment for learning. Basically on the principle that teachers couldn't teach properly to get students through exams. If they work better with the exam criteria, sharing it with the students, that will lead to grades going up. And I think in most schools the view is that that's the right thing to do, because I think there's a kind of assumption that when we did what you're saying has happened, you just get taught knowledge and it might take you beyond it. It wasn't leading to effective, another word, buzzword, effective results. And so there's a definite tension between the beauty of an examination as really recapitulating knowledge and developing the mind versus assessment, which is the way the system, I think, is being driven at the moment. Okay, Richard, your points.
Okay, I'll try and make three very good points. Firstly, I want to challenge the idea that examination, success, results, etc. are necessary for young people to kind of lead successful lives. My background is Steiner Waldorf. I'm actually a trained Steiner Waldorf teacher and kindergarten teacher, and in the Steiner Waldorf system, most of the schools they don't do SATs. They just ignore them, and they probably do GCSEs to a very, very limited extent, and yet many of these children from that system go on to lead extremely successful lives, to get into universities on a routine basis, etc., etc. So the idea that somehow the examination success is necessary to being successful in the world just doesn't hold up, because there are examples where that's actually not the case. Secondly, I think there's a very tricky argument that needs to be had. It seems that quite a few of my colleagues here would possibly say that that there's nothing wrong with examination or testing in principle. It's just the way in practice that it's sort of manifested, the kind of manipulations to which it's subject, etc. Well, I think that's a tricky distinction to make, and I think you have to make that because I would be more inclined to say that there's something intrinsic to the whole phenomenon, the whole process of testing, making judgments, making assessments of children, which leads to the kind of very difficult consequences which, for example, Warwick Mansell, in his book, which I urge everyone to read, details in great detail about what happens to the assessment system when it is politicised. And then that leads me to my third point, which is something that I always kind of bang on about whenever I get the chance, is that the education system urgently needs to be taken out of the hands of party politicians and placed into an independent cultural body, which is what in fact Steiner said a century ago, and developed very kind of detailed arguments as to why that's the case. And everything he predicted a century ago about the negative consequences of politicians running the education system are absolutely right. And what I would like to see is what would happen to the examination system, the assessment system, if it were taken out of the hands of politicians. Then I might even be persuaded that it might be possible to create a kind of a much more humanistic way of testing, which, while it stays in the hands of politicians, is never going to happen.
Okay, thank you. Philip?
Yeah, I kind of, just taking up your last point, I've been thinking quite a lot about this business of what seems to me at times to be a kind of ridiculous polarisation of views about education, and they're expressed in all sorts of ways in the kind of discussions that we're having today. There's this idea that somehow there's, and God knows I was part of this. I mean, I found that the way in which the kind of inclusion debate was, well, it wasn't really a debate, but the whole inclusion thing that was handled by the last Labour government, by which I mean the one from 2005 onwards, was wrong-headed, because it seemed to put inclusion against aspiration rather than, I didn't understand why that polarity needed to be created. And it sort of made me listen to what I actually think is probably a siren voice about this idea that we could somehow construct a sort of Platonic or Marxist or whatever kind of forum that was somehow independent of our daily political round. I don't think actually we can do that for all sorts of accountability reasons. Just coming back to what I saw as being the kind of key things emerging from what everybody was saying in the first round of questions. The stress here is the relationship between the performance in the exam and the league table and everything that flows from that. And I have completely come to the conclusion that we should ditch league tables. I think they have come to be pernicious. And I say that as someone who agrees totally with Dave about actually examinations in the right way being something that, you know, can be about celebration, and even if they're apparently about a certain kind of failure, they're about learning more about yourself and how you're doing and all of that. I completely agree with that. But the way these league tables are used is so crass and misleading that I think, you know, we end up in a complete dead end with them. I think if we're not going to get rid of them, and I think there's probably no party political appetite anywhere to get rid of them, I think that we have to do something much cleverer about the value add that the school, that's a dreadful way of putting it, but it's the terminology that's used. Not just say, well, here's the cohort, good luck, oh, you lot have done very well and you lot haven't done so well. But actually understand what the baseline assessment is of the cohort going in a particular year, and what happens to them both collectively and individually. But that's a bit of a boring point to make. My basic view is get rid of league tables, and good things will follow.
Okay, back out to the audience again. Is the lady with the mic also wishing to speak? Okay, then we'll go on to this side.
I went to a Failing State School. It was a special measures when I was there. And in my year, only 40% of my year managed to get 3 A stars to C's, and that was an improvement from the previous year. So there's a lot of talk about spoon feeding, and we were lucky we were spoon fed. I actually think it's more a problem in private schools, successful private schools, than it is in failing state schools. And I would actually argue that for a student to get 3 A's at the end of 5 years at failing state school, that's not the same as getting 3 A's at a private school. Science, for example, our GCSE science paper was very typical of what is described as a dumbed-down paper. It was multiple choice, you could retake it as many times as possible over 2 years, and despite that, so many students still failed it. I remember experiencing once so many teachers left that they threw 2 classes of 30 students together into one hallway with 60 students and one teacher standing at the front shouting at the whole hall. So So I'd actually say that proofreading in state schools is quite rare. And I mean, you often over here academics talking about kind of private school students who are less capable of thinking than students who have to struggle through failing state schools. So actually I would say that spoon feeding isn't quite the problem. The problem is failing state schools, and that's what we should be addressing rather than turning around to teachers who have to struggle in such environments. I mean, yes, I was angry about having to take such a bad paper, but I realise there's a wider structural problem.
Okay. I think, if you go back, there's a lady next to you. Yeah, just on the failing state schools, by the way, that's precisely why Andrew Adonis said we're bringing in league tables, because we've got these failing state schools, so we need a measure, because otherwise they're just out of control. Anyway, next speaker.
Yeah, I've had all sorts of things going around in my mind, and I think picking up on what was said over here about teachers actually believing in their subject and having that confidence to teach beyond teaching to the test is really important. But I'm wondering, just coming sort of to my mind now, I should perhaps declare an interest because I actually train teachers of languages. And increasingly in schools we have to now supply teachers who can teach 2 languages because schools won't employ single English specialists. And that always means, or mostly means, that student teachers or teachers become qualified in one language which one presumes they're relatively fluent in, and a second language where they may only have GCSE or A-level equivalent. And that, if you think about what that means about... So this confidence and teaching to the test, it may be, and it may happen in other subjects as well, but we've got an awful lot of teachers around who feel obliged to be teaching to the test because of the external pressures, because they actually don't really know enough to go beyond that. Now that's a bit contentious, but I actually wonder how much that is a problem, certainly a problem in maths, certainly a problem in science, and certainly a problem in languages.
So in fact everybody's learning as they go along, teacher and students. Okay, and yes, this gentleman here, then we're going to come here.
I found what Tina said about the accountability agenda very interesting. Although I balk at the idea of giving up league tables, only because you do need to find ways of communicating to parents and having some kind of objective measures. But what are the solutions when you have such a poisonous influence of exams right across the education landscape? My daughter just moved from secondary, primary to secondary. They said at the beginning of the last year of their primary that they weren't going to spend lots of time on preparing for SATs. They kept on saying they weren't going to do it. But the whole year was absolutely built around SATs. It was a paranoid frenzy with the only treat at the end of a musical Oliver for the kids to be in. And that was it. What they learnt in that year was nothing. And then when they got to the secondary school, they were tested again as they walked into the door. It's completely poisonous. And I want to know what the solution is. At the moment, what I get from the Institute of Ideas and very reputable speakers is it's got to be bottom up. It's got to be from teachers that are prepared to shake this off and start focusing on subject-based knowledge. But is that the only way we can turn things around from a sort of bottom-up approach, an individualistic approach?
Well, that's a fundamental question for the panel, so we're going to come back. We've got 10 minutes to go, so we're going to try and get these questions in. Yeah, we'll just come forward again. And over here, can you just keep showing where your hands are after you speak? Okay.
I'm another history teacher. I think there seems to be quite a lot of us here today. I also teach politics as well, and on Friday afternoon, we spent the afternoon looking at why ministers resign. I don't need to prepare anything actually, I just need to touch on the television. Anyway, I wanted to just say a little bit about this distorting effect that we're talking about league tables. It isn't the exams, it's the distortion caused by league tables. Particularly the choices that schools make about the exams that they enter students for. I teach in a further education college, so I interview students who are turning up with a whole multiplicity of qualifications that they probably didn't need to do in order to get onto the courses that they want to do next. And of course it's all driven by a strong concern about league tables. Any history teacher, of course, will know a little bit about how a command economy works, particularly a Stalinist style of command economy, and that's exactly what we're seeing. The other thing, just briefly, I wanted to say,
Please,
very briefly, I also worry about the sort of cartel that we see with textbooks. The textbooks being written by chief examiners, which are then being sold in large quantities to schools.
Yeah, thank you. And then pass it forward to this lady here. And then pass it along. Yeah, and then we'll go over here.
I'd like to look a little bit at teacher training, because I think what we've heard here is assessment machine that has been created, and actually the people who are part of it, which are the teachers, got no idea about it. And I think to some extent that's what's happened this summer, where head teachers complain because they've got no idea how the assessment machine actually operates.
No, I need to take my course.
So I think it's a lot about teacher training, and also how information is disseminated to teachers, that somebody who I highly respect, like Mark Taylor, will misquote somebody like Dylan Williams and say that actually assessment for learning is for standard testing. So I think it's a lot about training.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for getting that quite right.
I just wanted to develop some of the points that James in particular was making about plagiarism in terms of teaching for the test, and pick upon how this plays out in higher education. Something people haven't really mentioned this morning is the tyranny of the learning outcome in higher education, and how students, before they will even start a course, will be presented with the 4 or 5 learning objectives or learning outcomes for that course. So in a way they're then told in advance what they need to achieve at the end of the 10 weeks, and more explicitly, I suppose, what they need to demonstrate in the assessment. That matched up with the pressure that we're under to always make our marking criteria very, very explicit to the students. And when messages do come out that we need to make marking criteria explicit for more disadvantaged students, the assumption is that students who come from quite advantaged educational backgrounds will already be au fait with how to write an essay, how to pass an exam, whereas less advantaged students need to have criteria made explicit. And these two things combined firstly lead to an instrumentalism which has really been touched upon, but I think more worryingly for me lead to a real academic conservatism and really prevent people, students, taking risks in writing academic papers.
Thank you. We've got just over 5 minutes, so we're just going to try and get these final questions in. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Please keep at 7, and then back to the panel. I've just been given the yellow card. I've made an executive decision. We're finishing at 12:05, as I'm doing the next session as well. That's okay. So we've got about 10 minutes. So questions, very briefly, please, then to the panel. Who's first? Yeah.
David was saying before about useless subjects and students coming in with subjects they don't need. In year 9, when I was picking my options, I was told to do 2 BTECs. I then got to A levels and told, well, that's 2 A's out the window, 2 B's out the window. So should head teachers be told to stop giving useless advice to students picking their options and rather go for subjects that will actually count for something at the end of it?
Yeah, the problem's not just teachers, but leaders of teachers. Pass it back, please.
I just want to make a comment about the number of exams. I've got 2 teenagers, one here and one 15, and nowadays they're doing 4 years of continuous exams because there's exams in both years of GCSE, then you've got AS levels, then you've got A levels. I am horrified at the stress levels on teenagers and the fact that they have no time to do other stuff, to go out, to develop as individuals.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, gentleman with the red sweatshirt, and then pass back to the hand right after that. Yeah.
Please tell this head of physics what to do.
You're the head of physics, right?
Head of physics, yeah.
Okay.
What is to be done about this accountability problem? Because it all comes down to, we can think what we like, and unless we're going to start a free school and do it ourselves entirely, we've got to go to work on Monday morning and someone's going to say, your exam results have to be like this, and if they're not, then the ultimate thing could be accountability if you keep sitting there saying, I don't believe in the system, so I'm not going to play the game. I mean, that's the reality. You said yourself, Mark, that these schools have got to get their results, and what's going to be done if you don't. So tell me what's going to be done.
Okay, I won't, but I'll
Here's one bit of advice. What you can always do to students is forget the assessment of the learning outcomes and write something interesting. And I do think one of the big problems that you're ignoring is that this is all about assessing your learning, or rather about assessing you as learners, rather than celebrating what you know. And I've said this many times, I'd rather people were knowers than learners. And I think if you are young people, and I agree with Dave, whatever you're doing, however you're being assessed, try and show what you know. It's really, really important. And that's the message. And you can do it. You can do it. Students are uncomfortable with it because they're obsessed by all the machinery you talked about. But best you can convince them very quickly to write something interesting. It just means forgetting about the meaningless objectives.
So those two students in the room from my school, I'm going to ask you what you know about the Cold War, not how you learn. Right. And behind you, you've got 3 hands. That's the last 3, then back to the panel. Yep.
I want to pick up on the student point about really valuing teachers who go beyond the basic exam syllabus, and also Tina's point about having an exam worth teaching to. As at the moment, the students and teachers don't get any recognition for the great work that they do in teaching beyond the exam. How do we create an exam worth teaching to with sort of greater depth of knowledge, without being overly prescriptive about which bodies of knowledge we subscribe to, which ones we value, which periods of history necessarily?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then forward to, yeah.
Yes, okay, very quickly. Yes, knowledge, subjects, proper exams, and I also say yes, accountability. I used to be governor of a school which would never have bothered to teach anything at all, frankly, without accountability. But let's talk about perhaps the accountability of primary schools. Would the panel consider the possibility of value of having a system in which you don't get to secondary school unless you reach a certain standard in primary school? That would take a lot of pressure off secondary schools, and it would place more pressure in justifiably on primary schools to send children to be prepared to secondary school.
Okay, fine. Last point here. Remember, we've got quite a few people raising a fundamental question. You know, can you build it from the grassroots? What are you going to do about it? And we expect you to have an answer. Yeah.
Good question. Children need to be able to think divergently, i.e. there's not one answer and the person in the corner doesn't know that answer either. How can exam systems work towards that?
Okay. So we're going to go back in the order that we started with. So that will be Philip, Richard, Tina and James. I just want to add though that in my teaching, there are marks for independent judgment, certainly in history. You know, it's on this assessment objectives thing, but it does tend to be 1 mark at the bottom on the assumption that most students won't get there anyway. I think that is it's not like the exam rules it's saying it's not there, but I think getting there properly is very difficult. Okay, final remarks, Philip.
Right, imagine 11 to 18 education is constructed in this way. There are no external exams until the end. There is some form of internal generated teacher examinations as you go along. There's a broad brush curriculum that gives us the space in every subject to do the kinds of things that we've been talking about. As I think, just imagine that. That seems to me that it might answer a lot of the issues that we've been talking about. I think we've had a little bit of confusion in nomenclature between examinations and testing. To me, they imply 2 different things. You test for aptitude, for innate ability, which has dangerous connotations of being deterministic and this, that and the other. For me, I think you need to turn that around and think of it as being very useful reference points about the individual students that you have in the schools. But examinations about knowledge acquired, you can do them perfectly successfully on an internal school basis until there are needs at the end of the system, whether it's for university entrance, whether it's for work readiness or whatever it is, to have a suite of, if you like, more traditional type exams
right at the end. Imagine how liberating that would be for secondary schools in the UK.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Trying to make 4 very quick points. First of all, Philip, I completely agree with you about league tables. They've been an absolute catastrophe. I've said it right from the day one that they were first brought in. I've written about it at great length. There is nothing positive about league tables. The actual data they produce isn't valid anyway, so it's a chimera, and it's a symptom of a politician-centred education system. You know, child-centredness went out a long time ago. Some people are pleased about that, but we've got a politician-centred education system. Secondly, we've got a low-trust society. This obsession with being accountable, although the impulse from where that springs is no doubt a positive one, there's an enormous price to pay with a society that's obsessed with accountability. And it creates a kind of low-trust society, which I think is, again, catastrophic. C, learning outcomes. I just loved what you said about learning outcomes. Learning outcomes, again, are another catastrophe. They can only produce what David Harvey called status quo theory. You can only discover what's already been decided. If the great scientist Albert Einstein had been taught physics with learning outcomes, he would never have discovered relativity. Fourthly, this whole problem, it reduces to the issue of cultural anxiety. And until all the anxiety that's driving all this paraphernalia is kind of connected up with and is able to be thought about, nothing is going to change.
Okay, very, very briefly, so people can get to their sessions elsewhere. Tina?
There's a tall order. I'm actually going to try to answer the question, although this is just my opinion and it's probably not a full answer. I think that what we need to think about is a sensible accountability system. One that's not based on simply one factor, how students are doing on external examinations given at 11, at 16, and 18. What we do need, as part of this sensible accountability system, is national sampling. It gives you a snapshot of how students are doing nationally without having that anxiety and everything else built into every student being tested all the time. I'm okay with examinations at 18 for the reasons that both my colleagues have pointed out. I think in a sensible accountability system, we have teacher judgment in the mix. We have teachers who are well-trained in their subjects. I would like to see teachers with master's degrees in their subjects as something that they must do. We need teachers who love to teach, who are very enthusiastic about their subjects. That's not just about getting an MA, but it is about more. Part of that mix should include factors such as attendance, parental input, parental support, the amount of CPD, continuous professional development, on offer, the way that teachers form learning and teaching communities. I think we need a national curriculum that's a framework rather than a laundry list of facts, and that we need to bring back education for education's sake. Sorry, I went on a bit.
Thank you. Finally, James, 1 minute.
I've got an MA, a PhD, and a few others, but what I've not got yet is a PGCE. I can partially answer the question of what we should do as a result of the fact that I'm 5 weeks into my PGCE, whatever it's called. The answer apparently is differentiation. Unfortunately, I don't know what that is because that's week 7, so you need to come back to me next week and I'll tell you what to do. Just doing very quickly, I don't think we should fetishize exams. I think there are many potential creative ways of examining students that don't necessarily involve a 3-hour, 3-essay exam. However, I find myself being entirely bamboozled by why so many people are opposed to exams at the end of a course, and I think the answer to that is because they don't actually think the kids are up to it. So I think one answer very clearly is, if we don't think the kids are up to it, what's the point? Right? So let's first off start to actually have a sense that we've got something that's important to teach, and that the kids might actually be capable of benefiting from that. If we don't start with those two things, then we may as well give up now. I think the thing about who does it, very quickly, yes, bottom up. You know, I think we need to be a bit ballsier in our teaching. I think, though, the last thing we need is an independent authority in charge of education. I actually think we need to win some political arguments, because education is inevitably part of a political process. We need to win some arguments with people and actually establish the freedom to start experimenting with teaching.
Thank you. Absolutely brilliant discussion, I think. I hope you agree. If you're interested in following further, the Education Forum meets monthly. Round of applause for our panel.